You're on.
Thanks. I don't know if they put out the title of my message this morning, so in case you haven't heard it, it's Discipleship, Grace, and the Care of Widows. And when I sent this into Mary, she said about picking the hymns that go along with my message. What hymn goes along with discipleship, grace, and widows? I could think of nothing.
If I had known that, I would have looked for it.
So this morning, though, as Jane and I were wandering around out there trying to figure out how to come in, I said I should have picked Amazing Grace because we were lost, but now we're found. And I'm not sure it was from the grace of God or the grace of cell phones, but here we are. This message, I have a whole lot of scriptural references, so I'm not going to go nitpicking each one. I'll mention the chapter. And a lot of them I know you're very familiar with, so I might just paraphrase some of them. And I don't have that many messages in my quiver of messages, but this is only one on the Gospel of Mark, and this happens to be one of it. So the Gospel of Mark puts forward two overriding themes, identity and discipleship, generally asking, who is Jesus of Nazareth, and what are we to do for him? As to identity, Mark asserts Jesus as the Son of God and the Messiah, and a suffering servant. Concurrently, the Gospel addresses the theme of discipleship. What does it take to be a true follower of Jesus Christ? So it's the second theme, discipleship, that I want to discuss today. Discipleship in Mark is unique because he presents it as suffering discipleship. So it gives you a suffering servant who requires suffering discipleship. He emphasizes this by using a distinctive literary technique, which is to connect Jesus' passion with discipleship, a connection his 12 apostles repeatedly failed to comprehend. This gospel pattern, passion, apostolic and comprehension, and then teaching about discipleship, stands out as a unique Markan motif used to teach what it means to be a true disciple. So let's look at three incidents in particular, beginning with the Caesarea Philippi scene where Peter identifies Jesus as Messiah. So this is in Mark chapter 8 and 9. So Jesus teaches about the passion. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed. And he was stating the matter plainly. So then he had the apostolic and comprehension. Peter took him aside and said and rebuked him for what he was saying. But turning around, Jesus says to him, you heard this, get behind me, Satan. Now this is an important line here, because Jesus follows it up with, for you are not setting your mind on Jesus' interests, but men's. So then Jesus turns around and he starts teaching about his discipleship. Then he called the crowd to him along with the disciples and said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. So there's the pattern. Jesus tells them about what's going to happen to him. Peter messes it up, and then Jesus has to teach about discipleship. Moving on, just a couple days later, and this is in chapter 9, he was teaching his disciples, quote, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him. Still clueless, the apostles, they did not understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him about it. They came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, what were you arguing about on the road? They still don't get it. But they kept quiet because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. So again, Jesus has to teach about discipleship. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant for all. So for a second time, Jesus tells them about the passion. They don't get it, and he has to teach about discipleship. Now, a few days later, again, Jesus teaches about the passion. They're on their way to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way. Again, he took the 12 aside and told them, the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priest. They will condemn him to death. Still don't get it. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him and said, teacher, they said, we want for you to do us a favor. Jesus asked what? He said, well, let one of us sit on your right and one on the left. So again, Jesus has to take them aside, teach about discipleship. He called them together and said, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be the first must be servant to all. So for a third time, Jesus goes through this whole process. Now, as if discipleship, as presented in these three incidents, wasn't hard enough, Mark digs in a little deeper. So imagine this, you're sitting at work, home, wherever, one day, and some stranger comes by and says, get up, follow me. Are you going to do it? Chances are you're not. But let's say on a lark, like Levi did when Jesus asked him, he gets up and do it. So you follow him around for a few days, and he's teaching about what it means to be good. And you're like, yeah, okay. You go to him and you say, look, I've done all that. What else I got to do? And he says, sell everything you have and give it to the poor. Are you going to do it? No, none of us are. Chances are your reaction would be, you got to be kidding. So the cost of discipleship, as Christ lays it out, seems to be way beyond our desire to pay. It truly is suffering discipleship. None of us measure up, and honestly, none of us even plan to measure up to his stated expectation. So this Markan concept of suffering discipleship is rather harsh, bordering on the absurd. Perhaps no one has attempted a better explanation of discipleship than the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer in his book, The Cost of Discipleship, which is an exposition on the Sermon on the Mount. Bonhoeffer published this book in 1937 in response to the National Socialists, that's the Nazi takeover of power in Germany. He wrote it in response to what he saw as the acquiescence, the capitulation of the National Christian Church, or the right church, to the new unchristian social policies that were being implemented at the time. In this book, Bonhoeffer connects discipleship to this concept of grace. To explain this connection, I'm quoting most of this from an article by Mary Vandenberg titled Bonhoeffer's Discipleship, Theology for the Purpose of Christian Theology. Quote, Bonhoeffer's concern is about a doctrine of grace that does not connect to life in any real way, a grace that he calls cheap. Cheap grace means grace as doctrine, as principle, as system. This sort of grace is an abstraction for Bonhoeffer. It's a theological construction. For the person involved, it is nothing more than intellectual assent to an idea. It is not lived out in any way. And as a result, grace alone does everything. Everything can stay in its old way. The attitude of doing as I please since I am saved by grace is cheap grace. The contrast to cheap grace is costly grace, which entails a call to discipleship. Cheap grace justifies sin, allowing one to remain as he or she is. Costly grace compels sinners to change. Thus, the recognition of grace entails moving to a whole new life. The call entails discipleship. It entails moral change. Thus, fundamental Christian concepts have a purpose, a social intention. Boiled down, it means cheap grace, man's interest; costly grace, God's interest. Bonhoeffer interweaves discipleship with the Beatitudes. Of one in particular, he says, quote, those who mourn are the disciples who bear suffering for not embracing the success of the world, end quote. Now, that's pretty stark, but it is in line with what Jesus stated as his requirements. The conundrum for us is that if we did not embrace some worldly success, we would not be able to achieve any of the goals of discipleship. As Vandenberg and others point out, however, by, quote, not embracing the success of this world, Bonhoeffer meant not allowing the things of this world lull us into a false sense of redemptive security, not embracing the complacency of, I believe, therefore I am saved, not succumbing to religious vanity, arrogance, contentiousness, hypocrisy, or, quote, the attitude of doing as I please, since I am saved by grace. But both Jesus and Bonhoeffer recognize that cheap grace is inherent in individuals, therefore it adheres to organizations. Now, I'm sure you know the story of the poor widow found in Mark chapter 12. Quote, he says, he, Jesus, sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but the one out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. Now your first thought might be, aha, now that widow, that's costly grace, devoted to sacrifice. Well, maybe not. Your first thought, or our first shot, should be, why did the widow have to give out of her poverty? All those rich people were giving. Not one of them said, here, let me take care of you. Jesus never even did anything. He just used it as an example. Well, we wonder why. Well, I think, or others too, have thought that the point of the story is much deeper than just tithing a few coins. While rich in meaning, this story is often misinterpreted and misused as it is taken out of context of the 3 verses that precede it, which read, as he or Jesus taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplace, and to have the best seats in the synagogue and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses for the sake of appearance and say long prayers. They will receive a greater condemnation." End quote. So the scribes wielded unchallenged power and authority, and Jesus accuses them not just of overblown narcissism, but of, if not legal, at least a moral crime. They devour widows' houses. Beyond Jesus' praise of the widow's action, he is pointing out the fact that she is a victim of a hypocritical religious system. A system devoted to true discipleship would have taken care of her. She should not have had to contribute all she had to live on. The widow's contribution, while praiseworthy, is not the point of the story. A religious system rotting from cheap grace is. Recall Hosea 6:6, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." The scribes represented a system concerned only with man's interest. The suffering of the widow was God's interest. From Jesus to Martin Luther to Bonhoeffer, we find this cheap grace as, quote, doctrine as principle, as a system, infecting the church, putting church dogma or man's interest ahead of discipleship, God's interest. Do you see this anywhere in the church today? Well, ask yourself, have church divisions arisen out of doctrine, of devotion to discipleship, or devotion to dogma? With the story of the poor widow, Jesus shocks us out of our religious comfort zone. In his world, there's no place for people or systems that do not care about the vulnerable, or who, like the scribes, are oblivious to the circumstances that plunge others into poverty, disease, violence, exploitation, and suffering. Jesus tells us there is no place in God's kingdom for those who revel in the arrogance of cheap grace. They will receive the greater condemnation. One of the puzzling features of the Gospel of Mark is this disparaging portrayal of the 12 apostles, of whom he laments, "How much longer must I put up with you?" in Mark 9. If they who lived and walked and talked with Jesus himself couldn't grasp the essence of discipleship, how much harder is it for us? Fortunately, like the 12, we are always welcome back to try again, but try we must. If we deceive ourselves into believing we are saved by reading the Bible, worshiping for an hour on Sunday, tossing a few dollars at some charity, expecting others to care for the widows, then friends, we have bought ourselves a package of arrogant, cheap grace. The package that brings with it the greater condemnation. This hypocrisy of religion that so easily creeps into our lives is well expressed in James chapter 1, verse 26 and 7. Quote, "If any think that they are religious and do not bridle their tongues but deceive their hearts, their religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to care for orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself untainted, unstained by the world." End quote. So where does that leave us in our challenge of discipleship? Mark's literal suffering discipleship is perhaps unrealistic, a bridge too far. Bonhoeffer's conception of discipleship, while illuminating for us the hypocrisy of cheap grace versus costly grace, is still quite daunting. In reality, however, it is not that complicated. Our Quaker faith calls us to service. When put into practice, our testimonies are beacons lighting the path of discipleship. We simply need to follow our faith tradition, which calls for so much more than Sunday worship and charitable giving. The answer probably lies very simply in Isaiah 1:17. Quote, "Learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow." End quote. Amen.
Amen.